It is crucial that everyone understand the basic structure that was created by the founders and which has endured ever since. There are two entities called the United States. The continental United States, comprised of 50 geographically defined nation-states, acting as a federation. The United States was never a sovereign nation, just a business association, folks. It's the land-based states that are separate sovereign nations, and the federal United States comprised of 57 states. The 50 federal states plus federal territories and possessions, which are counted as states of their union, which is supposed to operate exclusively in the international jurisdiction of the sea. The continental United States equals 50 separate nation-states operating as a nation on the land jurisdiction. Federal United States equals 50 incorporated franchises of the United States of America operating the international jurisdiction of the sea, plus 7 nation-states, Guam, Puerto Rico, etc., operating as the United States of America, for a total of 57 states. This is the way it is, and the way it has always been. The federales and their federal state agents are not supposed to be trespassing on our land jurisdiction, except to serve and take care of and monitor their own citizens and attending to their duties as contractors. The confusion and the fraud began in earnest in 1911 when banks operating as a private association of banks, deceitfully calling themselves the Federal Reserve, bought the United States of America Incorporated, a governmental services corporation, and took over the agencies of the federal United States. They literally bought such familiar agencies as the United States Department of Transportation and began operating them as subcontractors without telling anyone. They then proceeded to pull off a criminal fraud gambit against the whole nation, and eventually the entire world, beginning with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and continuing the 1933 bankruptcy of the United States of America Incorporated to the present day. The United States, defined as the District of Columbia, went bankrupt in 1933 and was declared so by President Roosevelt in Executive Orders 6073, 6102, 6111, and finally as consolidated in Executive Order 6260. The reorganization of the bankruptcy is located in Title V of the United States Code Annotated. The explanation at the beginning of 5 USCA is most informative reading. The Secretary of the Treasury was appointed as the receiver in bankruptcy. As a bankrupt loses control over his business, this appointment of the office of receiver in bankruptcy had to have been made by the creditors, who are foreign powers or principals as revealed in Title 27 USC 250.11 and elsewhere. The Secretary of the Treasury being referenced is the Secretary of the Treasury of Puerto Rico, an officer of the Federal United States, who was designated as the receiver in bankruptcy by the foreign creditor banks. The United States as corporator and state declared insolvency. A permanent state of emergency was instituted within the Union, and the Federal Reserve has acted as the fiscal depository agent of the creditors ever since. Please note that the member banks of the Federal Reserve are all privately owned corporations. You can find that at 22 USCA 286D. The government, by becoming a corporator, lays down its sovereignty and takes on the character and the status of a private citizen. It can exercise no power which is not derived from the corporate charter. The corporate charter adopted by the federal corporation, aka U.S. Corp. Included, the Constitution of the United States of America. Please note how that is written. As its bylaws, which are, of course, as bylaws, subject to change and interpretation just like any other corporate bylaws. The Constitution of the United States of America also remains as a public commercial contract which is being traded upon by corporations claiming to be successors and holders in due course of the original contractual agreement known as the Constitution for the United States of America. Notice that it is for the United States of America in this, and please pay attention to the capitalizations of the letters. They are very much important. The real party in interest in the bankruptcy proceedings is self-evidently not the de jure United States of America or state, but the bank and the fund. These acts committed under fraud, force, and seizure are many times done under letters of marque and reprisal, that is, recapture, in behalf of foreign governments at war. This is an important point to remember as this discussion goes forward in time. On March 17, 1993, on page 1303 of volume 33 of the Congressional Record, Congressman Traficant stated, "Mr. President, we are now here in Chapter 11. Members of Congress are official trustees presiding over the greatest reorganization of any bankrupt entity in the world history, the U.S. government. The U.S. government is government domiciled in the District of Columbia, which at various times purports to represent three distinct entities. The first one is the U.S. corporation formed as we have just seen and as documented at Title 28, 3002. Number two, the continental United States, defined as the 50 States United, a confederation of separate nation-states operating the land jurisdiction. And third, the federal United States, defined as the District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico, and others, along with the corporate franchise federal states set up in each of the land-based states. In this comment, Congressman Traficant was including all three primary meanings of U.S. government as the term general government or U.S. government with a capital G, which is traditionally used in the Congressional Record when this meaning is applied. However, and this is the supremely salient point, there is no indication that the several, now 50, United States were ever bankrupted except as presumed voluntary adjuncts. In other words, folks, we didn't know this was going on. FDR and his buddies pulled the semantic deceit of all time. The actual entity in bankruptcy in 1933 was the foreign government of the federal United States, allowed under the Downs and Bidwell decision and several other Supreme Court cases known as the Insular Tariff cases circa 1900 to 1904. Like South America, these federal states can claim to be American, and they can form a union of their own, and they did so. They have been operating as the United States of America and as a constitutional democracy since the 1980s. The problem with the constitutional democracy is that if 51% of your neighbors want to eat you for breakfast or steal your home, they can do so. And that is the form of government operating in the federal United States now. We, the people inhabiting the continental United States, are owed a republican form of government, which upholds the sacred rights of individuals and abhors mob rule. And therein lies the rub. That and the gross deceit involved in having two separate nations operating under the same umbrella by the same group of people and under virtually the same name. Often, the only way you can tell the two entities apart is the word "the." It's the capital T in the United States of America, which is the major, and the little t in the United States of America, which is the minor. Using the same name, United States of America, allowed a great deal of self-interested confusion and corruption, including confusion at law. Its immediate effect during the onset of the bankruptcy of the federal United States was to transfer control of these states and completely, by semantic deceit and misrepresentation, the de jure continental United States too, as they appeared to be named as parties to the bankruptcy, into the hands of the creditors and their agents, administering this bankruptcy under the authority of the Secretary of the Treasury of Puerto Rico. The perpetrators of this plot deliberately misrepresented their employers, the landed states and the continental state citizens, as voluntary sureties for the debts of the bankrupted United States of America Incorporated, without telling us one word about it, without making any clear and honest disclosure of the circumstances, without even admitting that an international banking cartel had interjected itself as a middleman between the actual states and the people who pay all the bills of the federal United States and the agencies responsible for carrying out the duties owed. This misunderstanding on purpose allowed the banks to loan the perpetrators vast sums of credit, which the banks created out of thin air merely by entering numbers on a credit ledger based on the assets of all the states, continental and federal, and all the people, continental state citizens and federal citizens too. All this credit, made available to the United States Congress, was based on hypothecation of the perpetrators' debts against the assets of the states and their citizenry. Hypothecation is a stealthy process by which the perpetrators pretend that a third party has volunteered to stand good for a loan for one of the originators. Think of the co-signing a car loan for cousin Billy Bob, without ever being told that you and your property were ever offered as collateral backing his debts. The bank quietly takes a lien against your property on the presumption that you have agreed to pay the bill for Billy Bob if he doesn't pay off his own loan. That is exactly what the Federal Reserve did in 1933. It placed maritime salvage liens against every person and real asset in America, securitized them, that is, placed dollar value on you and your land and your state, and loaned the Congress all sorts of vacuous credit based on your assets and your labor. Another way to imagine this situation is to assume that a big corporation with lots of franchise operations, say something like Burger King or Sears, went bankrupt and offered its customers and their assets as collateral backing its debts. The colluding Federal Reserve eagerly agreed to this scheme, full well knowing that none of the supposed sureties had been informed under conditions of full disclosure and consent. They did it anyway, in criminal collusion. The result now is fully recognized under the doctrine of odious debt. The supposed debt owed by the states on the land and the American people was created by blatant criminal fraud of which they were unaware and from which they did not profit. The proceeds of this cozy arrangement between Congress, the government agencies, and the Federal Reserve banks were poured into whatever projects the banks and their puppets in Congress wished to pursue for profit, such as the entirety of World War II and all the nasty, unjustified wars for profit that the United States has engaged in ever since. The people never received even the goods and services they contracted for, but all expenses related to this fraud scheme were nonetheless charged off and their account and held against their labor and assets, their land, their homes, their vehicles, even their body parts. So folks, odious debt is a debt of exactly the kind described above, and neither the continental United States nor the people living in the 50 states are responsible for it. The corporations and the institutions and corporate officers who created and benefited from this mess are 100% liable, and we are not obligated to care if they like it or not. It is their mess, and theirs alone. Furthermore, they are not allowed to use credit and assets that they purloined and siphoned off from the continental United States and the people to pay all the debts they authorized above and beyond the 19 enumerated services they were supposed to provide the states under the original equity contract known as the Constitution for the United States of America. A completely different kind of document apart from the deceptively and similarly named Constitution of the United States of America. These hyenas siphoned off the vast credit created by the labor and resources of the continental United States and the people on the land, and passed it on to the secondaries, which they named as our fiduciaries, conveniently without telling us, and instead telling us and the rest of the world that we are bowed under by a vast $20 trillion national debt. Their corporation no doubt owes us a $20 trillion credit, which they are trying to avoid paying by shuffling off their assets to collaborators and seeking bankruptcy protection for themselves. But we are on to their ploys now, and heading down the home stretch. We know where the credit side of the national debt went, and we have filed UCC-1 claims to tell the rest of the world the truth. We know the lies and chicanery that the banks and the members of Congress engaged in, and the false, unauthorized misrepresentations that these criminals made in our behalf, while pretending to represent us. We are now presenting ourselves. To bring things up to modern times, the Federal Reserve Association bankrupted the Federal Reserve System Incorporated in 2009. Prior to that, colluding banks and government agencies divvied up the spoils. The Federal Reserve kept the liquid assets, land and human chattel, and gave hard assets, gold, to the World Bank as their share. Then in 2011, China remembered that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was holding a large stash of nationalist Chinese gold from 1928 that had never been returned. So they raised their hand about the gold owed and the interest on that gold. This made everyone else remember the German gold held by the same bank. And hey, what about all the gold confiscated from Americans by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his thugs? So, the hunt was on, and the World Bank and IBRD were and are in the most uncomfortable position of being in receipt of stolen goods. Gold stolen from us and many, many others over the last 150 years.